The first time I heard her voice, it was more chilling than any scream. My phone buzzed on the countertop, jolting me from a half-empty cup of coffee and a morning routine of predictable comfort. I picked it up, expecting a message from Colette confirming our schedule or Jonas asking for updates on the Texas expansion. Instead, I confronted a voicemail so brief it felt brutal, like a surgical incision with no anesthesia. No greeting, no hesitation, no apology. Just 5 words that severed 14 years of partnership and nearly as many of marriage. You're out of the family business. No Malcolm, no love, no thank you. Just a cold, mechanized pronouncement delivered in the voice of the company receptionist I barely recognized. I stared at the black digits on the voicemail screen, replaying the message over and over, as though slow motion could reveal a missing phrase or a hidden please. Each playback confirmed the same sterile goodbye. My mug, still half full of lukewarm coffee, sat abandoned at the edge of the sink. The machine hum of the refrigerator filled the silence in the kitchen, louder than any discussion that might have preceded this moment. I closed my eyes. In 14 years, I had poured my sweat into every contract, every supplier negotiation, every payroll calculation. Yet somehow, I was now less than a footnote in the enterprise I helped build. Instead of reaching for my phone to unleash a torrent of anger or confusion, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened my laptop and navigated to an old email thread I'd bookmarked 2 years ago, after a chance meeting at a business forum in Lisbon. The subject line simply read, Corporate Options. The sender was Dr. Mira Langston, a corporate law specialist with a reputation for orchestrating silent exits and untangling tangled legacies. I reread her initial message, still formal and concise, and then clicked reply. I typed a single sentence. It's time. Let's discuss options. No emotion, no backstory, just intent. I hit send before my pulse could thunder too loudly in my ears. A few moments later, I closed the laptop and reached for my coffee, now cold. I took a deliberate sip, tasting the bitter grounds and the residue of too many late nights and early mornings. I looked out the kitchen window at the gray morning sky, the familiar skyline of our neighborhood suddenly feeling foreign, as though I'd blinked and awakened in someone else's life. My mind rewound through every scene I'd lived within these walls. Colette's distant smile at our wedding reception, the day Jonas officially joined the board, the crisis year when I drained my personal savings to cover payroll so no one would lose their livelihood. I realized I had never thought of those sacrifices as transactions. They were investments of blood and loyalty. Yet loyalty had no seat at the table this morning. I set the mug down and walked to the wooden cabinet where I kept the binders of corporate paperwork I'd amassed over the years, financial forecasts, supplier contracts, debt refinancing agreements. Colette and I had always joked that one day I'd write a book about the behind-the-scenes work that made Bryhelm Steelworks survive storms no one else saw coming. Now, perhaps, I would. I opened the nearest binder and let my fingers trace the colored tabs. 2008. The year of the first major overhaul, 2011, the year of the refinancing, 2015. The supplier contract renegotiations that saved us from closure, 2019, the year I covered payroll from my own account during that unexpected downturn. Each tab carried a story, a victory, a quiet moment of decisive action. I closed the binder and carried it to my desk in the living room, where light from the bay window pulled across the polished wood. I sat down, placed the binder before me, and let the morning settle. I didn't pace or plan retribution. Instead, I organized. I pulled each document from the binder and stacked them in neat piles: contracts, financial records, email threads documenting board votes. I drafted a new email to Mira. Please advise on next steps. I'm prepared to move forward immediately. I clicked send and leaned back, eyes closed, breathing evenly. The familiar hum of the city rising outside reminded me that the world continued spinning, that life marched forward regardless of personal ruptures. In that moment of stillness, I realized I was no longer defined by Colette's decisions or Jonas's ambitions. I was defined by my own expertise, my own preparations, and the evidence of 14 years of unacknowledged labor. I stood, grabbed my coat from the hall tree, and paused by the front door. I glanced back at the house we shared, its framed photographs, the mantel decorated with family mementos, the trophies and plaques celebrating Bryhelm's achievements. I noticed for the first time that none of those objects bore my name. They were tokens of a legacy that had been rewritten without my consent. I opened the door, stepped onto the porch, and inhaled the crisp morning air. No greeting, just goodbye. But I intended to answer, not with outrage, but with deliberate, calculated action. The game had changed. I closed the door behind me and walked toward the car, feeling lighter than I had in years. The cold voicemail still echoed in my mind, but it no longer held power. I was out, she had said. Understood. And that was more than enough. I wasn't always invisible. Once upon a time, my name meant something within those glass walls. Colette used to introduce me as the brains of the operation back when we stood side by side at conferences, back when her smile didn't feel like a mask and her touch didn't make me flinch. When her father passed, it was the three of us, Colette, Jonas, and me, who stepped into the void he left behind at Bryhelm Steelworks. He hadn't planned to go so suddenly. Heart failure took him before he could finalize the succession plan, but it was always assumed that the business would pass to Colette and Jonas. I never argued that. I never needed to. I didn't want the spotlight. I wanted stability, growth, and structure, something solid in a world of shifting loyalties and economic storms. Jonas was the face, the one who shook hands and toasted deals. Colette was the name, the legacy everyone respected on paper. And I was the workhorse. The man behind the spreadsheets, the one who ran point when the plant's furnace shut down in 2009, who rebuilt the vendor network during the steel crisis of 2011, who absorbed the blow when our shipping partner collapsed and we had 5 containers stranded in port. I didn't take vacations. I took liabilities and made them breathable. When Colette wanted to fly to Aspen for a retreat during our most volatile quarter, I didn't flinch. I stayed behind, recalibrated the logistics chain, and even dipped into my savings to ensure that the hourly workers didn't miss a check. I never told her how much I pulled out. I didn't want credit. I wanted peace. I wanted us to survive. But survival in silence has a cost. I started noticing the shift in small, almost laughable ways. At first, it was the calendar invites, the weekly operations meetings that used to automatically populate on my schedule. They stopped arriving. I checked in with IT. A system update, they said. Should be fixed soon. It wasn't. Then came the shared drives. I logged in one morning to find that several key files, financial models I had built, audit templates I personally updated, had restricted access. I was no longer admin, I was viewer, then not listed at all. I approached Colette. Just a tech hiccup, she said, brushing it off with a kiss to my cheek that landed too light, too practiced. We're reorganizing some things. Nothing big, but it was big, and it got bigger. I noticed Colette and Jonas spending more time in the corner office, blinds drawn, whispers replacing transparency. I walked into the boardroom once during one of their meetings, and Jonas looked at me like I was a ghost, his smile faltering, his voice catching mid-sentence. They weren't planning strategy. They were writing me out. The tipping point came during a quarterly strategy session. The company's new organizational chart had been drafted and displayed on the main screen. Colette was now CEO, officially, not just by influence. Jonas was strategic lead. My name wasn't there. Not under finance, not under operations, not even under other. I sat at the end of the conference table, a printed agenda in front of me with my initials in the footer, because I had written the damn thing, and watched as everyone else nodded along like the erasure wasn't shocking. I didn't speak. I didn't cause a scene. I simply left the meeting 15 minutes early and walked back to my office. Or rather, what had been my office. A temporary sign had been placed on the door, workspace assignment pending. My badge no longer opened the executive floor elevator. I called Jonas. No answer. I texted Colette. She replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. That night, I drove home, walked into the den, and opened the drawer where I kept every piece of our company's financial past. Contracts, vendor agreements, old memos her father had written by hand, back when handshakes still mattered. I found the old company charter, scanned the bylaws, and confirmed what I already knew. I still owned 35% of Bryhelm Steelworks. They could cut me out of meetings. They could revoke my badge. But they couldn't erase ownership, at least, not legally. Still, the psychological dismissal had already begun. They wanted me to get the message. They didn't want me around. I wasn't malicious. I wasn't misaligned. I was just inconvenient. A man who remembered every decimal and signature, every deal that had kept us afloat. And I started to realize something else. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had grown afraid of me. Not because I was aggressive, But because I was the one with the receipts, I knew which suppliers had given us preferential terms after I'd taken them to dinner. I knew which loans we secured by mortgaging inventory they'd already claimed in internal forecasts. I knew what happened behind the polished quarterly summaries Colette signed off on, smiling in her tailored blazer like everything was bulletproof. But it wasn't. It was duct tape and trust. And I was the one holding the duct tape. That night, after brushing past the untouched wine Colette had left on the counter, I went into my office at home and reopened the email thread with Dr. Mira Langston, the lawyer I'd met 2 years ago in Lisbon. She had handed me her card after a conference panel and said, "If you ever need to disappear the right way, give me a call." Back then, it was a joke. Now it was a lifeline. I typed 4 words, "I'm ready to begin." And as I clicked send, I didn't feel panic. I felt still. Finally, after all this time, the man behind the numbers was about to speak his own language, one binder, one clause, one signature at a time. It didn't come with a single, dramatic moment. There was no heated argument, no official letterhead dropped on my desk with the word termination stamped in red. It was slower, crueler, a methodical unraveling that felt more like rot than rupture. The first thread pulled loose the day I realized my calendar was empty. I'd always had a standing invitation to the executive meetings, supply chain updates, finance briefs, legal consultations, but now those events no longer appeared. At first, I assumed it was an oversight, a sync error. I emailed Jenna in admin, who told me she'd check with IT. "Probably a permissions thing," she wrote. "These new systems glitch all the time." I waited. Nothing changed. Then came the missing drives. Shared folders I created, meticulously organized, labeled by fiscal quarter and region, were now restricted. I clicked on the Q2 forecasting sheet and got a grayed-out message. "You no longer have access." I tried again, a different folder, same result. Files I had authored, templates I had updated for a decade, suddenly locked. I reached out to Jonas, copying Colette. "Looks like I'm locked out of several shared assets. Any idea what's going on?" No reply, not even a thumbs up. I walked into Colette's office the next morning. She was sitting behind her desk, fingers tapping something on her phone, eyes low. "Morning," I said. She nodded without looking up. "Quick question," I added, keeping my tone light. "Looks like I'm missing access to a few essential files. You know anything about that?" She finally looked up, expression unreadable. "IT's been moving things around," she said. "It's probably just a restructure. I'll have Jonas check." That was the last time I brought it up to her directly. My badge stopped working next. At Bryhelm, the executive floor had secure elevator access. You tapped your ID badge, and it buzzed you in. I had been doing that every day for over a decade. That Monday morning, it blinked red. No buzz. I tried again. Nothing. A junior analyst came up behind me, tapped his badge, and it opened. He smiled awkwardly. "Want me to hold it for you, Mr. Price?" I nodded, said thanks, and stepped inside. The air up there felt different, staler, like I didn't belong anymore. When I asked HR, they said they'd look into it. Probably a glitch, they echoed. Glitches, it seemed, had become epidemic. The erasure was so gradual that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But then came the board update. A quarterly document I helped draft every cycle, my fingerprints on every table, every forecast. This time, the draft arrived in my inbox, already finalized. It had Colette's signature, Jonas's notes, but none of my data. I wasn't even CC'd on the distribution. It had been forwarded to me by mistake by a middle manager who assumed I was still part of the loop. I stared at it for a long time, a chart with a timeline of strategic goals. I recognized many of them because I wrote them. I proposed them at last year's retreat, and now they had my words, but not my name. It all culminated on a Thursday morning. I walked into the boardroom for what I thought was a weekly planning session. The screen at the front of the room displayed a new org chart, sleek, color-coded, filled with names and titles. At the top, Colette, CEO. Below her, Jonas, strategic lead. Then a cascade of other roles, finance director, HR head, legal counsel. Nowhere was my name. Not under operations, not under finance, not even under special projects. I scanned every line like I was reading a foreign language, hoping I missed something. But I hadn't. The air left my lungs. It wasn't a firing. It wasn't even a demotion. It was an erasure. I looked around the room. The others avoided my eyes. One or two gave me a small, uncomfortable smile. One of them coughed into her hand, as if to fill the silence that followed the display. No one said anything to me. I stood there a few seconds longer, then walked out. No one followed. Back in my office, I shut the door and just sat at my desk. Everything around me felt artificial, like I was sitting inside a museum replica of the life I used to have. The books on my shelves, the plaques on the wall, the branded notepad with the Brighthelm logo, they all felt like props. The truth settled slowly, thick and heavy. I wasn't being moved aside. I was being deleted, one folder at a time. One calendar update I was forgotten on. One executive decision I wasn't consulted for. It wasn't an accident. It was a campaign. I remembered something Colette's father had said years ago, back when he was still running things and still trusted me enough to give advice. They never push you out with a shout, he told me. The real betrayals are done in whispers. And that's exactly what this was. Death by 1,000 quiet cuts. I closed my laptop and walked out of the building without telling anyone. As I drove home, I didn't listen to music. I didn't even think. I let the silence fill the car like fog. When I got there, I poured myself a drink. Not something I did often, but it felt necessary. I sipped slowly, watching the light refract through the amber liquid, thinking back to when I believed effort earned loyalty. Then I stood up, walked to the home office, and opened the drawer where I kept the hard copies. Binders, dozens of them. Years of work, documentation, contracts, approvals. They wanted me to vanish, but I had proof that I had existed, and soon, they would know just how big of a mistake they made trying to write me out. The name on the card had stared at me for 2 years, quietly nestled behind a paperclip in my desk drawer. Dr. Mira Langston. I'd met her at a corporate panel in Lisbon, back when I still believed in phrases like shared equity and family trust. She wore a gray suit sharper than most knives in my kitchen and spoke with a voice so calm it could have anesthetized a crowd. The panel had been about legacy restructuring, how to prepare for quiet exits, generational disputes, and ownership detanglement in family-run companies. At the time, I had half listened. Jonas was texting me about a client dinner that Colette wanted me to attend in his place. I wasn't looking for escape back then. I was just exhausted. But Mira noticed something. Maybe it was the way I lingered after the panel, or how I asked a question that wasn't really about policy but more about silence. The kind of silence that grows like moss between relationships. When we shared a coffee, she slid her card across the table. In case the structure ever begins to swallow the architect, she said. I pocketed it and didn't think much of it. Until now. I sat in the stillness of my home office, the walls thick with books and printouts, and typed out an email that felt like a keystroke into a different life. I own 35% of Brighthelm Steelworks. I'm ready to explore options. That was it. No pleasantries. No background. Just fact. I pressed send and stared at the screen. A full year ago, I would have worried how it looked. What tone I'd used, whether I seemed rash. But now, stripped of position and title, I realized I had nothing left to protect except my own truth. Her reply came 43 minutes later. No frills. Let's begin with quiet diligence. I'll send encrypted transfer instructions. Do not use work devices. Short. Surgical. Steady. Exactly what I needed. I printed the message and placed it under a folder marked Foundations. It was already thick with notes and documentation. I opened another drawer and retrieved copies of old board memos, bylaws, and equity breakdowns. Brighthelm's operational structure hadn't changed much since 2013, a fact that now worked in my favor. The bylaws were outdated, untouched for years. And most importantly, they lacked a right of first refusal clause. That meant I could transfer my shares to any buyer without the board's approval. No roadblocks. No vetoes. That clause, missing, overlooked, and underestimated, was about to become my leverage. The next morning, Mira sent another message. Let's coordinate a valuation through independent means. Discretion is key. She was already 5 moves ahead. She looped in an acquisitions consultant named Daniel Croft, soft-spoken, clinical, the type of man who looked like he never rushed and never panicked. We set a meeting at a discreet office building downtown, a space with no signs, just frosted glass and quiet confidence. Inside, Daniel didn't offer small talk. He reviewed my documentation with a kind of reverence I hadn't experienced in years. You've kept detailed records, he said, leafing through pages of emails, signed contracts, and payment stubs. Most people don't document operational goodwill this well. I wasn't documenting, I replied. I was surviving. He nodded once, like he understood exactly what that meant. Over the following weeks, we initiated a valuation of my stake, one that Mira insisted be conducted externally and quietly. Bryhelm wouldn't even know what was happening until it was too late. Mira called it quiet diligence. Daniel called it phase 1. I called it breath. Each step gave me a kind of clarity I didn't know I'd been missing. It wasn't revenge. I wasn't plotting a downfall. I was drawing a boundary for the first time in years. I was reclaiming my narrative, no longer waiting for permission to exist in the spaces I built. We began organizing the sale of my stake. Not to a stranger, but to an entity Daniel controlled, one that could later resell, restructure, or hold indefinitely depending on the strategy. Myra's firm would act as the legal intermediary, shielding my name while honoring the transfer. I wouldn't have to step foot in the Bryhelm offices again. I felt like a man walking out of his own funeral. Alive. Unburied. As part of the preparation, Mira asked for a timeline, an annotated overview of my contributions, investments, sacrifices. I delivered more than she expected. I showed her the breakdown of when I covered payroll from my savings in 2015, the vendor discounts I negotiated that saved over $300,000 in annual costs, the interest we avoided because I refinanced high-risk debt without fanfare. I had copies of emails Colette once praised me for, back when I was still indispensable. Mira called it unusual clarity. Daniel simply said, "This isn't a paper trail, it's a story they forgot you wrote." It struck me then how easily someone can be buried while still standing. You can be called family and treated like inventory. You can save a company without being saved from it, but not anymore. I stood outside Myra's office one morning, early, the city still waking up behind me. The fog sat low over the skyline, and for the first time in months, I wasn't dreading the day. I had made a decision, not in anger, not in haste, but in truth. I texted Mira, "Proceed with all documentation. Let's finalize." Her response, "Acknowledged. Transfer window opens Friday. You'll be out before they notice the door swinging shut." And that was the point. I didn't need to slam the door. I didn't need a dramatic exit or a viral video. I needed freedom. Quietly, completely. And with Mira and Daniel behind me, I knew I would have it. I became a collector not of things, but of proof. While they were busy erasing me, I was quietly building an archive. It started the day after Mira confirmed the transfer structure could proceed. She asked for supporting documentation. I didn't just give her receipts, I gave her a story. I opened the credenza in my home office, the one Colette used to tease me about. "You treat paperwork like gold bars," she once said. That was before she stopped seeing value in anything that couldn't fit into a polished press release. Inside that credenza were binders. Dozens. Maybe more. Each one labeled by year. Color-coded by department. I ran my fingers across the spines. 2010, supplier realignments. 2012, crisis year budgets. 2015, personal contributions. They weren't fancy. Just basic office supply binders filled with printed emails, signed contracts, memos that were originally internal only. But they told the real story. The one Colette and Jonas had tried to rewrite with every closed-door meeting and strategic omission. The deeper I dug, the more I found. There was the invoice from when I used my personal card to fund emergency furnace repairs, $48, $923.62 paid out over 2 months while we waited for the insurance to clear. No one ever reimbursed me. No one ever asked why I didn't complain. They were too busy celebrating resilience at the quarterly meeting. I found the email from Colette thanking me for navigating our logistics mess during the West Coast port strike. Her exact words, "You saved us from a PR disaster." That was back when she still said, "us." I uncovered board minutes, official, laminated copies, where I was present, contributing. And next to them, I found digital versions that had been edited later. My name omitted. Contributions attributed to Jonas. I showed one to Mira on our next call. She didn't blink. "This is better than any affidavit," she said. "It proves intent." I printed everything. Everything. I spent 3 full days just organizing, cross-referencing, and building what Mira later called a forensic memory of the company. Daniel, ever the tactician, flipped through one of the binders labeled Q1, Q2 2019/payroll risk, and said, "This is undervalued leverage." They were impressed. I was just tired. This was my life's work, reduced to office supplies and footnotes. And still, they thought I'd go quietly. But what they failed to remember was that I wasn't the kind of man who left breadcrumbs. I laid foundations. I built frameworks so strong they could run without me for a while. That's the danger in being too effective. You make yourself seem optional. I cataloged everything into 3 sections: contributions, omissions, and violations. Mira was especially interested in the third. That's where I stored documentation of decisions made without full board votes, financial summaries that misstated risk, and the internal memos from Jonas Consulting Firm, a shell company I had flagged once but was told to leave it be. There was a memo Colette drafted alone during our expansion into Texas, referencing a real estate deal that hadn't been disclosed properly. It was all there. They had underestimated the man behind the spreadsheets. They thought because I didn't raise my voice, I didn't have one. I labeled each binder spine with precision, adding a final sheet in the front of every volume, an executive summary. Mira called it unusual clarity. I called it survival. My memory had always been sharp, but over the last few years, I sharpened it further. Out of necessity, out of pain, I remembered everything, not out of bitterness, but because I knew someday I might need it. And that day had come. I scanned every page into a secure drive Daniel provided, then locked the originals in a fireproof cabinet. We had a clean chain of custody, a legal narrative, a story with timestamps and signatures. When Daniel reviewed the totality of it, he let out a low whistle. They thought they were playing chess, he said, but you've been recording the game. He was right. They played for perception. I played for permanence. By the end of the week, I had assembled 12 volumes. One for each year I served as Brythelm's invisible scaffolding. They read like chapters in a book they thought I'd never write. But here it was, undeniable, unshakable. Colette and Jonas had counted on my silence. My discretion. They mistook quiet for weakness. But I wasn't weak. I was patient. And now I had every piece I needed. When I closed the last binder, labeling it the final quarter, I sat back in my chair and stared at the shelves. It looked like a library. My library. Not of fiction or finance, but of truth. The truth they buried under promotions and press releases. The truth they never expected to surface. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt exact. The final thing I added was a note. One handwritten sheet slipped into the front of the first binder. If you're reading this, it means you forgot who I was. Let this remind you. Then I closed the cabinet, turned off the lights, and stepped outside. The sky was overcast. The kind of gray that felt like a clean slate. I breathed it in. Let them have their meetings. Let them have their story. I had the facts. And soon, so would everyone else who mattered. The papers were signed in a nondescript office tucked between a travel agency and a defunct bookstore. No logos, no framed mission statements. Just neutral walls and the steady rustle of legal documents. There were no congratulations. No champagne. No family crest behind a lacquered conference table. Just the clean rhythm of departure. Daniel Croft sat across from me, his silver pin gliding across the final transfer sheet as if he were signing a dinner check. Mira Langston, ever precise, reviewed every page with the same quiet assurance that had made me trust her in the first place. I signed last. My signature, firm, unflinching, landed beside Colette's printed name on a clause she'd never seen coming. Brythelm's bylaws hadn't been updated since 2013, and that oversight was their first real mistake. No right of first refusal. No requirement for board review on minority stake transfers. In their arrogance, they'd left the back door wide open. I simply stepped through it. Daniel's firm, operating through an acquisition vehicle discreetly established under Myra's guidance, now owned my 35%. To them, it was a calculated investment. To me, it was a release. When the wire transfer cleared, Mira gave me a small nod. "It's done," she said. Just like that. 14 years, gone in a signature and a line item. There was no victory dance. I didn't punch the air or call anyone to gloat. I drove home in silence. The leather steering wheel felt unfamiliar under my palms, like I was someone else now. Someone lighter. Once home, I walked past the kitchen without a glance at the coffee maker. Straight to the office. The air inside felt different. Like something had shifted. The binders on the shelf, still lined up in color-coded order, now carried weight as legacy, not leverage. I sat at my desk and opened my phone. The old voicemail from Colette was still saved. "You're out of the family business." I listened to it one last time. 5 words that had once hollowed me out now felt irrelevant. I didn't need to delete it. I just let it finish, then hit reply. My response was simple. Understood. No anger. No explanation. No dramatic flourish. Just silence. Then I tapped the company app one last time and deleted my access, internal dashboards, HR platforms, vendor lists, my BETRAYAL email. Everything. One by one. It was like shedding old skin. The moment the final app disappeared from my phone screen, I felt a strange kind of peace. Not joy. Not satisfaction. Just absence. Like walking into a room and realizing the buzzing light you'd ignored for years had finally gone out. I didn't tell anyone. Not Jenna, my assistant who used to bring me notes with coffee stains on them and nervous updates about supplier delays. Not my old contact in procurement who once said, "If Malcolm says it's stable, we can rest." Not even Mira pressed me to tell anyone. She knew. Some exits are meant to echo. Mine wasn't. 2 hours later, I got the first email from Colette. Subject: unanticipated ownership movement. I didn't open it. I just watched the notification fade from the lock screen. I imagined her reading the buyout filing, the legal stamp, the official transfer to Daniel's firm. Imagined her realizing I was no longer within arm's reach, no longer one more asset to manage, no longer available for cleanup duty. Then the texts came. From Jonas. From Colette. From the BETRAYAL CFO who never returned my calls during the Texas project, but now apparently needed urgent clarity. I turned the phone face down. Later that night, as the rain tapped the windows and I stood in my kitchen sipping the first scotch I'd poured in weeks, I realized something strange. I didn't feel triumph. I felt space. The kind of space you only notice after years of compression. I walked through the house like a stranger. Not because it wasn't mine, but because for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying their chaos on my back. There was no inbox waiting for my reply. No Friday review meeting looming. No Jonas calling at 9:42 p.m. asking for a favor before the board call. No Colette sidling up with a softened voice when she needed something smoothed over. I was just here, present, whole. The next morning, I awoke before sunrise, not from stress or urgency, but from the sheer stillness of the room. I brewed coffee and opened the windows. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. By noon, Mira had sent me final confirmation of the asset transfer and a record of the equity change filed with the state. "You're officially out," she wrote. And for once, that phrase didn't sting. I didn't reply immediately. I let the moment hang. Eventually, I replied with 2 words. "Thank you." No elaboration. No need. Because now, I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come. I wasn't hoping to be seen by people who only valued me when I fixed what they broke. I had walked out without slamming the door, and for the first time, that was enough. I didn't expect the fallout to come so fast. I thought I'd get a few days of silence, maybe a trickle of confusion once the filing went public. But no, the call started less than 24 hours after the ownership transfer was complete. Colette called first, twice, then Jonas, then a flurry of numbers I didn't recognize, board members, department heads, probably even a few vendors by day 2. They all wanted the same thing: clarity, answers, reassurance. But I wasn't in the business of reassurance anymore. By noon the next day, I had 72 missed calls. I didn't return a single one. I turned off notifications, let the phone vibrate into silence on the edge of my desk. There was something almost poetic about it, how they only realized I was essential once I wasn't available. When I was doing the heavy lifting, smoothing every misstep and threading together their bad decisions with quiet logic, I was just Malcolm, background noise. Now suddenly, I was the man whose name echoed through panicked voicemails. It took 3 days before I finally picked up. I wasn't planning to, but something about the silence between the rings made me answer on instinct. Jonas's name flashed on the screen. I swiped to answer and said nothing. Just let him speak first. "Malcolm," he breathed, voice raw, like he hadn't slept. "You need to undo this. The new investors here. They're tearing through our books like a chainsaw. They've frozen 3 accounts already. They're asking for all the backup from the Texas expansion. And Jesus, they're questioning Colette's approvals. It's bad. Really bad." I waited. He kept going. "They're digging. Not just audits. They're questioning hiring decisions. They're pulling expense reports." They flagged the consulting contract I had for my firm. You remember that one? It's not looking good, man. You're the only one who can explain the logic behind the internal structuring. You set up those flows. You wrote the forecasting models. Just come in. Help them understand it. Tell them it's fine. I took a long breath. Looked out the window. That sounds like standard diligence, I said, calm and cold. You don't understand, Jonas snapped. You're the only one who can walk them through the logic. We can't afford for this to go sideways. I stood, walked to the shelf, and pulled out the binder labeled Texas, Initial Expansion. I flipped through it while he rambled emails, vendor approvals, timeline shifts, last-minute substitutions made because Colette wanted to move faster than the data supported. You told me I was out, I said evenly. Silence on the line. Click. He hung up. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the binder in my hands. All the things I'd done to hold that mess together, all the corners I had to straighten, all the half-built blueprints I'd been asked to clean up, every piece of it, now being scrutinized without me to shield them. And I wasn't going to step back into the storm I had just walked out of. Let them face the cracks. Let them answer for the shortcuts. That afternoon, I received an email from the new investors audit team. Formal, efficient, and unmistakably serious. They requested a meeting to verify transitional documentation and contextualize existing records. I didn't respond. I forwarded the email to Mira. Within 20 minutes, she replied, "No need to respond directly. We'll handle the chain through counsel." Later that evening, I walked past the kitchen and into the living room, where the late sun filtered through the windows, laying warm stripes across the hardwood. I stood in that glow, listening to the hum of a home no longer under siege. It was the first time in years that I wasn't carrying their emergencies like unpaid debts. I didn't miss the phone calls. I didn't miss the endless fire drills disguised as strategy. What I felt instead was space. The kind that doesn't echo, just expands. By the next morning, the calls stopped. Not because they'd figured it out, but because they finally understood. I wasn't coming back. I wasn't theirs to summon anymore. And that kind of silence, the one they created, spoke louder than any voicemail ever could. By the time Mira called with the update, I was already expecting it. I'd been watching the storm form from a distance, calm in the knowledge that, for once, I wasn't the one who'd have to clean up the damage. I was sitting in my home office, sorting through a few remaining documents from my own records when her name lit up the screen. "It's escalating," she said, straight to the point. "The audit team has uncovered more than just disorganization. We're talking $1.2 million in unreported losses over the last 3 fiscal periods. And that's just the surface." I didn't say anything right away, just leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, letting the words settle. "They found a consulting firm linked to Jonas," Mira continued. "A shell company with inflated invoices and no deliverables. They ran payments through it to mask internal reallocation of budgets, likely to preserve optics during their Texas expansion." Of course they had. Jonas had always been clever with optics. Not competent, clever. There's a difference. He was the kind of man who thought branding could outrun truth, that charisma could replace structure. And for a long time, I'd let him believe it could. Because I was behind him, steadying everything he leaned on too hard. "And Colette?" I asked, knowing the answer before Mira said it. "Signed a restructuring memo alone," she said. "Intentionally omitted your ownership in the internal filings. But she referenced it in the margins, likely to leverage your equity for lender confidence without your consent. That's fraudulent territory. So, it wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, packaged in boardroom casual. They had tried to cut me out while still banking on my presence in the shadows. It would have been laughable if it weren't so precise. She's asking for a private meeting," Mira added after a pause. "No lawyers. Just you and her. Wants to clear the air." I smiled. It wasn't bitter. It was the smile of someone who had finally stopped mistaking patterns for accidents. "I won't respond," I said. "File it under after." Mira didn't question it. She just said, "Understood," and ended the call. I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it after. Her email went in first. That afternoon, the local business journal published a short piece buried between real estate trends and a political op-ed. Headline: Bryhelm faces executive shakeup, stakeholder fallout amid audit. A single paragraph mentioned the ownership transfer, hinted at internal unrest, and quoted an unnamed source close to the board who called it a recalibration of legacy structure. I didn't post the article. Didn't send it to anyone. I clipped it from the paper, folded it, and slipped it inside the first binder I ever made for the company. 2010, vendor overhauls. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, alone, drinking from the same chipped mug I'd ignored the morning I got that voicemail. The coffee was hot this time. Strong. I sipped slowly, thinking about how long I'd been invisible to them, not out of malice, but because they assumed I'd always be there, like plumbing or gravity. Useful, quiet, dependable, forgettable. But there's something dangerous about forgetting who makes the machine work. When Colette and Jonas started calling it the family business, I used to think it was sentimental. I thought it meant we were in it together, that loyalty mattered more than title. But over time, I learned that family was just their branding. What they really meant was, you do the hard part, we'll take the credit. I thought about the dinners where they toasted each other while I was still back at the office finalizing contracts. The awards Colette accepted with my numbers in her speech and none of my story. The emails Jonas sent when deals went south always addressed to me, never copied to anyone else. They weren't partners. They were passengers who criticized the driver. And when the road curved too sharply, they decided to throw me out of the car rather than admit they couldn't steer. That was the hardest truth to accept, not that they betrayed me, but that I trained them to believe they could. I'd spent years being reliable, calm, private. I let them think my silence was submission, that my quiet meant I was content in the shadows. But what they never asked themselves was, what happens when the quiet one walks away? Now they knew. The next morning, I woke to a new email, this time from the internal communications director at Brighthelm. She BCC'd me by accident, or maybe out of habit. It was a draft of a company-wide memo, carefully worded to soften the edges. We are currently undergoing a transitional period. Auditing processes are standard. We appreciate your continued trust. I didn't reply. I didn't even finish reading it. Instead, I dragged the email into the after folder and closed my laptop. Later that day, I walked through the park near my home, something I hadn't done in months, maybe years. The breeze was warm. Children were running in circles near the fountain. People passed by with dogs, with coffee, with laughter. No one knew who I was. No one knew what I'd just left behind. And for the first time, that felt like freedom, not invisibility. I sat on a bench, let the sun rest on my face, and allowed myself to be a man, not a placeholder, not a pillar, just Malcolm. They could keep the titles, the offices, the illusion of control. I had the truth. And the truth was finally mine to protect, not theirs to use. They called it business, but I remembered when it was family. And now, they would remember what happens when the family they discarded stops being quiet. There's a kind of silence that isn't empty. It's not hollow or desolate or waiting to be filled. It's whole. I discovered that silence 2 weeks after my exit was finalized. It crept into my mornings first. There were no frantic calls from logistics, no emergency text from Jonas about a deal he botched and expected me to salvage. No Colette barging into my day with that half-soft, half-commanding tone. Can you just look at this real quick? That usually meant I'd lose the next 5 hours unraveling a mess she'd made in 15 minutes. Now, there was just quiet. I would wake early, not from obligation, but by choice. Brew my coffee, open the window, listen to the world as it was not as they always needed it to be. For the first time in over a decade, my calendar was mine. No fake urgencies. No meetings disguised as power plays. No weekly updates to board members who barely read them. The strange part was, I didn't feel relief in a loud, liberating way. It wasn't some roaring triumph or cinematic vindication. I felt breath, as if my lungs had been operating at half capacity for years, and only now was I remembering how it felt to breathe fully. My body reacted first. I stopped grinding my teeth. My headaches disappeared. I didn't need a second cup of coffee by 10 a.m. to stay sharp. I walked more. I slept better. I didn't realize how much of myself I had given away in exchange for being the reliable one. Colette and Jonas had never said it aloud, but their entire behavior suggested I was just an extension of their convenience. A built-in crisis manager. A financial safety net. A quiet fixer who didn't ask for applause. And for a long time, I thought that role gave me purpose. But looking back, it gave me weight. Heavy, suffocating weight that disguised itself as responsibility. Now that I was gone, they had a problem. I didn't need to spy or dig for updates. Brighthelm's unraveling was visible in the pauses. Investors delaying decisions. Vendors suddenly reassessing their partnerships. A few longtime employees messaging me with vague phrases like, "It's been weird around here," and "They're trying to cover too many holes." But I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. I knew those systems. I built them. They weren't designed to run on panic and pretense. And as they scrambled, I found stillness. I read again. Not just contracts or financial reports, actual books. I reread Baldwin, Sontag. Even cracked open a few novels I'd bought years ago and shelved with good intentions. I cooked meals that didn't involve takeout containers or desk-side snacks. I spent hours on my back patio watching the sky shift from pink to gold to navy, and I did it without guilt. But more than anything, I started thinking about what it meant to be essential. They didn't cut me out because I was useless. They cut me out because I was necessary and no longer controllable. That realization hit me one quiet Thursday morning as I reviewed a short memo Daniel had sent. It detailed the first major shift the new ownership group would be making. They were restructuring the Texas expansion entirely, scaling back, reassessing partnerships, investigating the consulting firms Jonas had funneled money through. There was a polite line in the summary. Recommendations reflect an effort to untangle legacy misallocations. Legacy misallocations. That was their polite way of saying, we're cleaning up the mess made by people who called themselves visionaries while someone else quietly paid their debts. I smiled, not because I wanted revenge, not even because I wished them failure. I smiled because I knew something they didn't. I had been the core of the structure, not the logo, not the name, not the bloodline. And now that I was gone, the shape of the hole I left was unmistakable. A few days later, I went to lunch with an old friend. Andre, one of the few people who'd known the whole story for years but never pushed. He'd called me when the audit hit the papers, just to check in. No questions, just a let's eat. Over coffee and sandwiches, he leaned forward and said, "You look like you slept." "I did," I said, laughing softly. "Every night this week." "You know, they always said you were the glue," he added, swirling the last sip in his cup. "But I don't think they realized what happens when the glue walks away." "They thought I was background," I said. "Turns out, I was the foundation." Andre grinned. "Now what?" That question lingered. What comes after walking away? What do you build when the structure you poured yourself into becomes a cage? I didn't have an answer that day, but I knew it wouldn't involve going back. I wasn't going to start another version of Brighthelm. I wasn't going to wage a public war. The beauty of silence, I discovered, was that it had its own gravity. It drew attention. It made people ask questions. It revealed character. The silence I left behind was doing all the work for me. The board had started scrambling. Their investor confidence was shrinking. New leadership meant change. Audits. Transparency. Brighthelm had relied on shadows. Now it had to perform under a spotlight. And I was learning to be a man without a title again. A man who didn't need constant motion to feel real. A man who could exist without being everyone's first call when something broke. They couldn't fill the space I left behind, because they never truly saw the shape of what I was until I was gone. And now, the most powerful thing I could do was nothing at all. Let them chase. Let them spin. Let them finally face the consequences of building their future on a person they never planned to credit. I walked home that afternoon with a peace that felt earned. Not handed, not begged for, earned. The silence followed me like a shadow. Not haunting, just whole. It arrived on a Tuesday, late afternoon, bundled in a thick manila envelope that bore no return address, just my name, scrawled in a familiar script I hadn't seen in months. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, sitting at my dining table, the light catching dust in the air like particles of a memory too stubborn to settle. Inside the envelope was a single item, a photo frame. Heavy, glass-fronted. The same one that had stood in the lobby of Brighthelm Steelworks for over a decade. The image inside hadn't changed. Me, Colette, and Jonas standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the original brick wall of the plant, all three of us grinning like we just climbed a mountain together. It was taken the day we signed the final paperwork from Colette's father's estate. The day we officially became partners. The smiles were sincere then, or so I thought. I remember what it felt like, belonging. Like we were starting something worth preserving. Now, though, there was a faint, jagged crack across the glass. A spiderweb fissure running diagonally from the top left corner down across my face, bisecting it neatly. The others remained untouched. Intact. Preserved. I turned the frame over. No note. No message. Just the fractured image, enclosed in silence. I set it down on the table, not sure what reaction I was supposed to feel. Anger? Sadness? Vindication? But I felt none of those. Just a deep, tired recognition, as if the crack had always been there, and I was only now seeing it in the right light. I didn't fix the frame, didn't throw it away either. I placed it carefully in the bottom drawer of my office desk, the one where I'd begun collecting the artifacts of this chapter: clipped news stories, printed emails, court filings, letters unopened but saved. Not as trophies, as proof. I wasn't holding on to gloat. I was holding on because one day I might need to remember what it felt like to be broken and still choose silence. A few days later, I ran into an old colleague at the market, Elaine, from procurement. She hesitated when she saw me, then offered a smile laced with uncertainty. "Malcolm," she said, as though saying my name was an apology. I nodded. "Hey, Elaine." We stood by the produce, between apples and green peppers, the air thick with things neither of us wanted to name. "How are things over there?" I asked casually. She sighed. "Different. Quiet. A lot of shifting. The new ownership team's not like you. They don't ask questions, they just issue orders." I nodded again. I wasn't surprised. She shifted her weight and said, "They talk about you sometimes." "Oh, mostly in past tense," she said with a half smile. "But not in the way you'd think." I tilted my head. "They say things like, Malcolm would have known how to solve this, or we should check if Malcolm had a spreadsheet for that. They're looking for your footprints, still trying to walk in them." I didn't respond right away, just looked past her toward the front of the store, where the light poured through the tall windows. "I hope they figure it out," I said eventually. Elaine touched my arm gently. "You did good work. A lot of us know that, even if they never said it." I offered a quiet smile. Sometimes silence says enough. We parted ways with a nod. No fanfare. No reconciliation arc. Just two people who once shared a war room now crossing paths in peace. Later that week, I sat in the garden behind my house, the one I hadn't tended properly in years. The azaleas were blooming again. Colette used to love them. Ironic, really, how something she once adored could now thrive in her absence. I spent hours out there. No laptop, no phone. Just soil and breath and sky. I didn't think about audits or buyouts or legacy detanglements. I thought about nothing, and it was glorious. That night, I opened the drawer again and looked at the frame. The crack across my face seemed deeper now, as if it had grown in my absence. But that wasn't the truth. I had grown. The crack had always been there, it was just more honest now. Some people make noise when they leave. They slam doors. They curse names. They demand to be heard. Others slip away so softly you don't notice until everything collapses behind them. I didn't leave to hurt anyone. I didn't exit to cause chaos. I left because I had given more than they knew how to value. Because I realized, far too late, that being the glue meant they expected me to be invisible and still hold everything together. But glue dries. It cracks. And when you pull too hard on what holds you, it snaps. They said, "You're out." I said, "Understood." It was the most honest conversation we ever had. In the months that followed, Bryhelm restructured. Investors stepped in, new names rose, old titles fell. Jonas quietly resigned. Colette took a sabbatical, though that word felt generous. Rumors floated of an internal settlement, of NDA-covered apologies, of questions that didn't have neat answers. But none of that belonged to me anymore. One morning, as I watched the sun spill across my desk, I pulled out a blank sheet of paper. Not a spreadsheet, not a strategy outline, just a page. I wrote one sentence. What do I build next? Not because I needed revenge, not because I needed restoration, but because I was ready. That was the difference. They tried to make me small so I wouldn't notice how big I'd become. But now, with silence in my chest and peace in my breath, I could see everything clearly. They built a structure. I had been the foundation. They walked on it. I walked away from it. And sometimes, that's the strongest move a man can make.